Picture this. The year is 1932. The streets of Chicago are silent except for the crunch of worn shoes on frozen pavement. Men once proud providers now line up for bread, their eyes hollow, their coats thin. Children stare through store windows at food they can't taste. Farms rot in dust, cities crumble in despair, and an entire nation whispers one haunting question. How did the American dream turn into a nightmare? The Great Depression wasn't just an economic collapse. It was a human tragedy that rewrote the soul of America. Beginning with the stock market crash of October 1929, it spread like a slow-moving storm, swallowing banks, farms, and families in its path. One by one, dreams turned to dust. Unemployment soared beyond 25%, factories shut down, and once thriving cities turned into ghost towns of broken hope. But behind the statistics were faces. Mothers stitching worn clothes by candlelight. Fathers walking miles for a day's work. Children learning too soon the taste of hunger. The Great Depression reshaped not just the economy, but the nation's identity, its politics, and its faith in progress. It forced Americans to confront their deepest fears of failure, of hunger, of helplessness, and to ask how a land of endless promise could fall so far. What happened in those desperate years still echoes in every recession, every lost job, every dream deferred. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy dark history stories like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your feedback in the comments. It began quietly, almost invisibly, like a shadow creeping across a bright wall. October 1929. The heart of Wall Street throbbed with energy, but beneath that pulse, something dark had already started to stir. The tickers clicked endlessly. The numbers spun faster than anyone could comprehend. And then, suddenly, they began to fall. What was once a symphony of prosperity became the sound of panic. Brokers shouted, papers flew, and the great dream of endless growth shattered like glass. Men who'd built fortunes on borrowed money watched everything evaporate before their eyes. Outside the exchange, the air was thick with disbelief. Some stood silent, their faces drained of color. Others muttered to themselves, as if words could undo what had just happened. It wasn't just a crash, it was a collapse of faith. America had believed it was untouchable, that success was permanent. But overnight, it learned that even the mighty could crumble. In the weeks that followed, panic spread faster than the flu. Banks shuttered, businesses folded, and those who still had jobs clung to them like lifeboats. Imagine walking to work one morning and seeing the factory gates locked. A simple sign reading, "Closed until further notice." The paycheck you depended on, gone. The landlord doesn't care that you lost your job. The grocer won't trade food for promises. Pride begins to erode, replaced by fear. Bread lines stretch down entire blocks, filled with men who never imagined begging for food. They stand silently, hands in pockets, eyes on the ground, ashamed. Behind them, children wait at home, too hungry to play, too tired to dream. Newspapers become blankets. Cardboard becomes a bed. People burn furniture for warmth. The laughter of the roaring 20s fades into the moans of survival. The Dust Bowl began to smother the Midwest at the same time, turning fertile plains into barren wastelands. Winds carried entire farms into the sky. Dust seeped into lungs, beds, and dinner plates. People wore wet cloths over their faces to breathe, but it didn't help. Mothers rocked coughing infants, their tears leaving trails through the dust on their cheeks. Farmers who once produced food for millions could no longer feed their own children. The soil itself had turned against them. When they looked at their fields, all they saw was death, of crops, of hope, of the life they once knew. Many packed what little they had into rickety trucks and drove west, chasing rumors of work in California. On the road, families slept under bridges, scavenged for food, and prayed for rain. Those who stayed behind buried more than their crops. They buried their dignity. But here's the chilling part. Even those far from the fields weren't spared. City streets filled with the displaced, the jobless, the broken. Banks failed in waves, taking people's savings with them. You could wake up rich and go to bed penniless. Money, once a symbol of stability, became meaningless paper. People bartered for what they needed: a coat for a sack of flour, a day's labor for a pair of shoes. Communities tried to help each other. But when everyone is drowning, how can anyone save someone else? The government tried to project calm, but their words rang hollow. "Prosperity is just around the corner," President Hoover said. But for the man shivering in a soup line, the corner never came. Desperation breeds strange choices. Some turned to petty theft, others to faith, and some simply gave up. Suicide rates climbed. Newspapers carried stories of men jumping from windows, of families vanishing into rivers. People began to see the world differently, not as a land of promise, but as a place that could betray them. And yet, through the despair, a quiet kind of heroism emerged. Strangers shared what little they had. Churches opened their doors to the homeless. Children scavenged coal near railroad tracks to warm their families. Musicians wrote songs that carried sorrow and hope in equal measure. The blues, the folk ballads, they weren't entertainment anymore. They were survival. Still, the Depression was merciless. Winter came early in 1931, freezing water pipes and human hearts alike. The sight of frost on windows meant another night of cold hunger. In cities, makeshift shantytowns called Hoovervilles sprang up. Collections of cardboard shacks, tin roofs, and despair. Families lived side by side, separated by thin walls but united by suffering. They built fires from scrap wood, cooked soup from bones, and prayed the wind wouldn't tear their shelters apart. Children learned to recognize hunger not as a passing feeling but as a constant companion. And yet, in those same streets, laughter sometimes returned. A reminder that even in ruin, the human spirit flickers. Every morning brought a new test of endurance. People lined up at employment offices that never called their names. Farmers watched clouds drift across barren skies, waiting for rain that would never fall. Politicians argued in Washington while families starved in silence. But through it all, something in the American psyche hardened. The Depression wasn't just about money, it was about identity. It stripped away illusions, revealing what people were truly made of. Those who survived would never forget the taste of despair, nor the strength it took to face another day when everything had been taken from them. The Great Depression didn't just break the economy, it broke the myth of invincibility. It taught a proud nation what it means to be fragile. By 1932, America was unrecognizable. Entire cities seemed to sleep under a gray fog of despair. The optimism that once defined the nation had been replaced by quiet endurance. The photographs of that time still speak in whispers. Faces lined with hunger, hands rough from endless labor that no longer paid. A man selling apples on a corner for 5 cents was not a rare sight. It was a symbol of survival. People who once managed businesses now begged for work, cleaning the very streets they used to walk in pride. Imagine waking up in a city that once buzzed with jazz and ambition, now echoing only with the sound of footsteps and the hollow rumble of hunger. The Depression had stripped everything bare, not just wealth, but confidence, trust, and even hope. In rural towns, the suffering took on a different shape. Dust storms tore across the Midwest like biblical plagues, blotting out the sun and burying entire farms beneath mountains of soil. People nailed blankets over windows, sealed doors with mud, and prayed that the wind would stop. It didn't. Each gust was a reminder that nature itself had turned hostile. Crops failed, cattle starved, and water became as precious as gold. Families fled in caravans of rusted cars, carrying mattresses tied to roofs, children clutching toys that would soon be sold for food. They called them Okies, migrants who poured into California hoping to find work picking fruit, only to be met with hostility and fences. The promised land turned out to be another illusion, fields already full of desperate men. There were too many mouths, too few jobs, and too much anger. In the cities, relief lines grew longer, stretching past government offices that struggled to distribute what little aid they had. Soup kitchens overflowed. Police had to turn people away. Newspapers carried stories of families freezing to death in their homes. Even the rich began to feel the chill. Mansions were sold for a fraction of their worth. Jewels pawned, pride swallowed. People began to realize something profound, that the divide between the rich and the poor was not a wall but a fragile thread, easily snapped. "Brother, can you spare a dime?" wasn't just a song. It was a national prayer. That simple question became the soundtrack of a generation. But amid the chaos, something else began to stir. The idea that survival required unity. In neighborhoods across the country, people began organizing quietly. They shared food, repaired each other's homes, and formed barter systems to keep their communities alive. Church basements turned into classrooms, and abandoned lots became gardens. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were acts of defiance against despair itself. In places like Detroit and Pittsburgh, workers began to whisper about rights, wages, and fairness. The seeds of labor unions took root in the very soil of suffering. While the banks had failed, people discovered that the only true wealth left was each other. And yet, the pain deepened before it got better. The winter of 1932 was one of the harshest in memory. Temperatures plummeted, snow covered shantytowns, and fuel ran out. Fires burned low, and so did spirits. In Washington, the government was paralyzed by fear. Fear of spending, fear of losing control, fear of change. President Hoover still believed that the market would correct itself, that private charity could mend a national wound. But the people no longer believed. Veterans of the Great War, men who had once fought for their country, now marched on the Capitol demanding their promised bonuses. They built camps on the riverbanks, ragged and cold, holding banners that read, "We want justice." The government's response was brutal. Troops were sent in to clear them, burning their makeshift shelters, scattering their families. America had turned its guns not on enemies abroad, but on its own forgotten sons. But here's the haunting truth. Even in ruin, the human spirit refused to die. As Franklin D. Roosevelt prepared to take office in early 1933, a flicker of hope began to return. His words, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," cut through the darkness like a match in a long tunnel. People leaned toward their radios, listening as if salvation itself was speaking. The New Deal that followed didn't erase the pain, but it gave people something they'd lost: purpose. Men built roads, dams, and schools. Women joined community programs, teaching, sewing, organizing. Art and photography captured the struggle with honesty, turning suffering into a mirror for the world to see. America wasn't healed, but it was moving. Still, the scars ran deep. Families that had lost everything carried that wound for generations. A whole nation learned to save every scrap, every penny, every ounce of hope. Even when jobs returned, people didn't forget the fear of losing them. The Depression had turned the American dream into something humbler: survival, security, and the quiet dignity of work. Yet beneath it all lingered a question that still haunts the country today. How could the world's wealthiest nation have fallen so far, so fast? Was it greed, ignorance, or simply the arrogance of believing the good times would last forever? When the clouds of despair finally began to lift, America was not the same. It had been broken and remade, tempered by suffering and united by necessity. The skyscrapers still stood, but the people who walked beneath them had changed. They knew the price of failure, the weight of hunger, the value of compassion. And as the country began to rebuild, one truth echoed quietly across its cities and plains: that prosperity without empathy is a fragile illusion, and when it shatters, it takes millions with it. By 1934, the Great Depression had carved deep trenches not only in the economy, but in the human soul. The country staggered forward like a wounded giant, bleeding hope but refusing to fall completely. Dust storms still swept across the Great Plains, turning noon into midnight and burying entire farms in suffocating waves of earth. The photographs from those years tell stories no words can truly capture. Children with dust-crusted faces, their eyes wide and hollow. Mothers with cracked hands holding babies wrapped in rags. Fathers staring at the horizon as if searching for a past that would never return. The air was thick with silence, the kind that only follows years of grief. But amid that silence, something else began to take shape. A quiet resolve, a collective understanding that survival itself was a victory. Communities that had once depended on distant systems of credit and commerce now relied on each other. In the heart of the cities, people traded not for profit, but for sustenance. A loaf of bread for a day's labor, a repaired roof for a pot of stew. Barter markets popped up in parks and alleys, and though they offered little, they gave people purpose. It was a strange paradox. In the absence of wealth, people had rediscovered worth. Imagine walking through a Hooverville at dawn, smoke rising from makeshift chimneys, the faint sound of a harmonica drifting through the cold air, children chasing each other around tin shacks with laughter that sounded almost defiant. They had nothing, yet somehow they still had life. The government's efforts under Roosevelt began to reshape the landscape. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work planting trees, building trails, and repairing the land that the Dust Bowl had ravaged. The Works Progress Administration hired artists to paint murals, writers to document history, and builders to construct schools and hospitals. For the first time in years, the clang of hammers and the murmur of workers replaced the eerie silence of despair. But recovery was uneven. While some regions began to heal, others remained trapped in poverty. African American communities and immigrants faced even harsher realities, often excluded from the programs meant to help all. The Depression revealed not only economic weakness, but moral ones, the prejudices that determined who deserved relief and who didn't. Still, people found ways to endure. Families gathered around radios every evening, listening to Roosevelt's fireside chats. His voice, calm and confident, seemed to reach directly into their homes, reminding them that they were not forgotten. It's hard to imagine today how powerful that sound was. A voice that cut through fear, telling millions that tomorrow could be better. For many, it was enough to keep going. Children who had grown up during those years carried memories of scarcity that would define their entire lives. They learned to save, to fix rather than replace, to find joy in simplicity. And in that generation, a new kind of resilience was born. One built not on luxury, but on gratitude for the smallest things. But the shadow of the Depression lingered even as the economy slowly revived. The psychological wound was too deep to vanish overnight. People distrusted banks, avoided debt, and never forgot the humiliation of standing in line for food. It became a collective scar, a reminder that security could vanish at any moment. The culture itself changed. Art, literature, and film began to reflect the darkness of the age. Stories of struggle, endurance, and injustice became central to America's identity. Even as prosperity returned in the late 1930s, that darkness never fully disappeared. It lingered in every cautious investment, every meal scraped together, every sigh of relief that the worst was over. At least for now. Then came the final twist of fate, the slow approach of another world war. By the early 1940s, as Europe descended into chaos, America's factories roared back to life. The same men who once stood in bread lines now built tanks and airplanes. The Depression ended not through peace, but through preparation for conflict. It was a cruel irony that war, not policy, would finally restore prosperity. But for those who had lived through the hunger, the fear, and the dust, the scars never healed. Even in times of victory, they remembered the taste of loss. And yet, through all that darkness, the Great Depression left behind something unexpectedly beautiful. Empathy. The experience had forced people to see each other, not as competitors, but as fellow survivors. It broke the illusion of endless success and replaced it with an understanding of shared vulnerability. When someone lost their job or home, neighbors no longer looked away. They understood. Compassion became currency. The generation that endured those years became the backbone of what would later be called the greatest generation, shaped not by privilege, but by pain. The legacy of that time still echoes. Every financial crash, every recession, every family struggling to make ends meet carries faint memories of those dark years. They serve as warnings that prosperity built on illusion is temporary, that ignoring the suffering of others leads only to collapse. The Great Depression was not just a chapter in history. It was a mirror. It showed America its true reflection. Proud but fragile, ambitious but reckless, hopeful yet haunted. And from that reflection, a lesson was carved in stone. That resilience is born not in comfort, but in the ashes of despair. The Great Depression remains one of the darkest chapters in human history, not just for the hunger or the poverty, but for the silence it left behind. It changed how America saw itself, how families treated one another, and how people understood survival. Behind every statistic was a story of loss and endurance, of pride stripped away and dignity slowly rebuilt. Those who lived through it carried its memory like a shadow, a reminder that strength isn't measured by wealth, but by the will to keep going when there's nothing left to hold on to. The suffering of that era should never be forgotten, because it wasn't just America's story. It was a warning to the world, a warning about greed, about arrogance, about forgetting the human cost of ambition. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, like the video, and tell us in the comments what type of stories you'd like to see. Your support helps keep these forgotten histories alive, so that the lessons of the past are never buried in the dust of time.